Meghan Markle holds a small envelope in her hand. Inside are the results of a DNA test. It is not a royal title or a film script, just a modern ancestry report filled with percentages and maps. She opens it anyway. For most people, family history comes from stories told around dinner tables. A grandmother remembers a specific place, or a father talks about where his parents grew up, passing names down through memory. But Meghan's test reveals a deeper story her family never fully knew. The report states she is about 43% Nigerian. You might think a discovery like this simply answers a trivia question. It doesn't. It pushes her family story far beyond the United States, reaching across the Atlantic Ocean directly to West Africa. Long before Meghan stood in front of cameras as an actress, and long before she married into the British royal family, her family history had already traveled across continents. To understand how far that family traveled, you have to look at the woman who sat alone in the front row of St. George's Chapel in 2018. Doria Ragland watched her daughter marry Prince Harry while millions of people viewed the ceremony live from their homes. Doria remained calm, quiet, and composed as centuries of royal tradition unfolded around her. The cameras returned to her again and again as she was the only member of Meghan's immediate family present. Most people watching the wedding believed they were witnessing a modern fairy tale, an American woman entering an ancient institution. But they missed the real story hidden right in the mother's name. Ragland is not simply a family identifier. It is a name that traces back to one of the darkest systems in American history. Long before Doria watched her daughter marry a British prince, her ancestors lived in bondage. They carried the last name of the man who enslaved them. That man was William Ragland. He came from Cornwall in England and emigrated to North America during the 18th century. Like many European settlers, he built a life in the colonies, settling in parts of Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. He worked in land speculation and built a plantation life, eventually deciding to build his wealth through land and slavery. He claimed ownership over human beings, and those enslaved individuals had no legal right to choose their own last names. They frequently carried the surname of the person who claimed ownership over them. That naming pattern is exactly how the Ragland surname passed into Doria's family line. The journey of that name began in England, traveled through southern plantations, and survived the total collapse of slavery. The harsh reality of this system becomes terrifyingly clear when you look at a man named Stephen Ragland. Stephen was born around 1848 in Georgia. His life began inside an economy that depended heavily on cotton plantations, where enslaved families worked the fields under constant control. If you search for Stephen's early life in official government records, you will not find his name. Instead, you will find an 1850 slave schedule from Henry County, Georgia. In that document, created as an estate inventory after a slave owner died, Stephen appeared only as property. The record listed his age, his gender, and his price. He was valued at $250. He was listed the exact same way land, animals, or tools might be listed. That was the system of chattel slavery. His value was written into a legal document simply so white heirs could divide the estate and transfer property. Being born into slavery meant Stephen had no legal control over his life, his work, or his future. The choice belonged entirely to the people dividing the estate. When the Civil War ended in 1865, slavery ended with it. For millions of enslaved people, freedom arrived suddenly, but it did not bring immediate stability. Former slaves faced a harsh new reality where land still belonged to plantation owners and jobs were scarce. Stephen Ragland entered adulthood in this incredibly difficult moment. The system changed its name, but sharecropping kept families tied to the exact same cotton fields, paying rent with a portion of their crop. Yet, in this fragile new world, Stephen made a choice that changed history. He married a woman named Maddie Turnipseed. Maddie was born around 1860, meaning she entered the world during the final years of slavery. She carried the surname Turnipseed only because she had been enslaved by people using that name. Her full given name was never preserved in any surviving documents. We only know her as Maddie because that is the name an enumerator wrote down in a census after the Civil War. This missing information creates a massive problem that genealogists call the 1870 brick wall. For millions of African American families, tracing ancestry completely stops around this year. Before 1865, enslaved people rarely appeared in official records with their names. Census documents only counted them as numbers on slave schedules. Imagine opening a historical record searching for your great-great-grandmother and finding only the words female, age 20, owned by someone else. That was the entire entry. The system was literally designed to erase identity. When the 1870 census finally recorded formerly enslaved people by name for the first time, the damage had already been done. Families had been separated through sales, and parents often lived on completely different plantations than their children. Because oral histories broke apart, under this intense pressure, many newly freed families did not always know the names their ancestors had used before slavery ended. Doria Ragland's ancestry sits directly inside this break in the historical record. There are no preserved family stories naming the exact village or region in Africa her family came from. Stephen Ragland lived until 1926, experiencing enormous changes across the country, but he remained in Georgia for much of his life. The real shift began with the next generation. The decades after the Civil War saw the rise of Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial separation and limiting opportunities, while violence remained a constant threat. Facing this danger, Stephen's children and grandchildren made a massive decision. They decided they could not build stable futures inside that system, so they left. They joined the Great Migration, moving north to Ohio, where factories in cities like Cleveland offered steady employment compared to unpredictable southern farm work. Leaving familiar places meant starting over, but for the first time, they controlled their own movement. The Raglands left the cotton fields entirely behind and entered the industrial world. The movement did not stop in the Midwest. During the 1950s, the family made another life-altering move, leaving Ohio and heading west to California. That journey carried them more than 2,000 miles away from the Georgia counties where their story began. 3 generations had now completely reshaped the family's path. In 1956, that journey reached a new chapter when Doria Ragland was born in Los Angeles. Doria grew up in a modern city, far removed from the harsh, aristocratic world her daughter would later enter, and a long way from the cotton fields where her ancestors once worked. She built a stable life, working in social work and yoga instruction, and raised Meghan with a strong focus on education and independence. While Doria's maternal family history centered entirely on African American survival in the American South, Meghan's father carried a completely different past. Thomas Markle's ancestors traced back to early settlers in New England during the 17th century. One of these figures was Reverend William Skipper, who arrived in America in 1639. The world he entered relied on churches to track family relationships through handwritten books, wills, and property papers. These records successfully preserved names across centuries, waiting quietly in archives. Yet the Markle family simply lost track of these connections over time, allowing the links to fade from everyday family memory. In 2017, genealogists working with the New England Historic Genealogical Society, began comparing these historical church registers and passenger lists. They uncovered a secret the family never knew. Meghan's paternal family line traced back through colonial settlers who descended from European noble families, eventually connecting to King Edward III of England. Through these deep connections, genealogists discovered that Meghan Markle actually shared distant ancestors with 8 American presidents, including George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon. You might assume Meghan grew up knowing about her presidential cousins or her royal blood. She didn't. Her family never passed those stories down. The Markle family simply did not preserve their colonial ancestry in everyday conversation. So when Meghan met Prince Harry and their relationship became global news, the media focused on an American actress entering the British royal family. The hidden irony was that somewhere in the distant past, her ancestors already shared ties to European royalty. Centuries earlier, the ancestors who stepped onto American shores unknowingly began a chain of relationships stretching across politics and royalty, and Meghan simply happened to be the person where many of those lines crossed again. These two vastly different histories met in one household in Los Angeles. One side carried a paper trail leading to English kings. The other side carried the legacy of an unnamed child valued at $250 on a slave schedule. Because of the 1870 brick wall, the exact origins of Doria's African ancestors seemed lost forever. That is exactly why the modern DNA test Meghan took changed everything. When she sat in front of a camera and shared that she was about 43% Nigerian, the internet exploded with immediate rumors. People claimed Doria Ragland must carry an exact mix of Nigerian and other African roots, spreading unverified numbers online. Some stories stated Doria was 45% Nigerian, while others swore she was 23% Ghanaian, and a few even hinted at secret European ancestry hidden from the family. This is a massive misunderstanding of how genealogy and science actually work. There is absolutely no verified DNA analysis showing those exact numbers for Doria Ragland. Commercial DNA tests work by comparing a person's genetic markers with large databases to estimate where those markers appear, most often in the modern world. The test companies produce broad regional guesses, not exact maps. The brutal history of the Atlantic slave trade forcibly mixed people from many different parts of West Africa. Once enslaved individuals arrived in the United States, generations of families formed across different communities, blending the DNA signals over time. Modern companies often label large portions of West Africa as Nigerian simply because the genetic patterns appear strongly in populations living there today. Meghan's result reflects a general West African pattern shaped by forced migration rather than a precise family origin from a specific village. The test also revealed other quiet threads hidden within the family tree. It detected traces of Native American ancestry, showing a mixture between about 0.8 and 2% indigenous DNA. This pattern appears fairly often among African Americans, usually stemming from undocumented relationships formed during or after slavery. Because written plantation records seldom tracked indigenous identities in these situations, the genetic traces stayed completely hidden for generations until DNA testing finally revealed them. The DNA also confirmed the presence of European ancestry on the African American side. During slavery, enslaved women frequently faced assault by white slave owners or others in positions of power. As a result, many African American families today carry both African and European DNA. This is not unusual, And it is not a hidden secret. It simply reflects the horrific historical reality of slavery in the United States. Paper records can be destroyed. Family names can be erased by slave owners. Birthplaces can completely vanish from memory. But small pieces of genetic code still travel through time. Inside every single cell, the story waited quietly. For generations, Meghan's ancestors lived without the ability to trace their true origins because social systems ignored their identities and legal systems reduced them to property. When Meghan opened that envelope holding her ancestry results, she was not just reading a list of percentages printed on a page. She was seeing 400 years of family history unfold in a completely new way. It is incredibly easy to look at a royal wedding and focus only on the dramatic image of modern celebrity meeting ancient monarchy. You might think Meghan Markle's story suddenly entered history that day, but the real story began generations earlier, with a woman known only by a single name, Maddie, who had no last name recorded at birth. It began with Stephen Ragland, an enslaved child written down as property worth $250. The name Ragland traveled through centuries of American history, moving from the control of an English immigrant slaveholder, surviving the collapse of slavery, migrating across the industrial North, and finally appearing at a royal wedding watched by millions. Doria Ragland's missing records do not mean her family's history vanished. It simply means the history was never fully written down by the people in power. Behind every single missing document stands a real person whose identity deserved to be remembered. When Doria sat in that royal chapel watching her daughter marry Prince Harry, the incredibly long journey of her family name reached a moment no one in its earliest history could have ever imagined. She stood as a visible part of a family line that was once forced into anonymity, a family that survived slavery, segregation, and forced migration. They built new lives while carrying fragments of memory from the past, keeping their families moving forward even when their history was hidden from view. The royal wedding did not begin their story. It simply revealed to the entire world exactly how far that family line had traveled.